and we're visiting from our community. We're really happy to have you here with us this evening. We have a number of guests from around the metro area that have come to be with us, and so we count you our honored guests and hope that you'll stick around a little while and give us an opportunity to get to know you a little bit better. This has been a wonderful day. We have feasted this day. It's been just a joy to be able to spend time with Randy and Mia Medlin and hear the wonderful lessons that we heard this morning and have an opportunity to have lunch together. This was a wonderful meal we had today, and thanks to all those who were part of the preparation of that. And just made for just a wonderful, wonderful morning. And so you're commended for coming back this evening to hear another lesson from Brother Medlin. Randy grew up in this area or in North Georgia, and he spent a great deal of his life here. He has preached for 45 years, 30 of which have been split between two congregations. The congregation at Avondale that here in Atlanta that many of you know him from. And so for that reason, it's not really an introduction for you, but as we have so many guests, certainly they need to hear about Randy. And so presently, and for the last 14 years, he has been at the university congregation in Montgomery, Alabama, adjacent to the Faulkner University campus. But again, I think we're really in for a treat. Randy and Mia have 4 grown children. They have 1 grandchild and 1 on the way. So they're carrying around a neat little thing. It's about this big, it's about that thick, and it's full of pictures. So if you see Mia kind of sporting that thing around, just say, let me see that grandbaby. So glad to have you with us. Preach the word, brother.
The honor has been all mine being with you good people today and renewing old acquaintances, making new friends, and we have thoroughly enjoyed it. And as far as I'm concerned, if the meeting ended tonight, it would have been a wonderful benefit in my life and a great blessing. And I'm glad to see all of you here tonight. I appreciate your spiritual interest as well as your priorities propelling you to this place of worship tonight. And I feel a little bit like the little girl who went to kindergarten. Now, this morning was a little boy. Don't confuse them. Little girl who went to kindergarten and came home, and mom said, "Did you learn anything?" She said, "I guess not. Got to go back tomorrow." So that may be how you feel if you were here this morning. I hope it's not because you didn't learn something, but because of your priorities and interests being in the right place. By the way, it's been a wonderful experience, as Scott mentioned, being able to eat lunch with him and his good wife and share some time with them. By the way, I learned today from watching Scott eat that he is a very scriptural preacher. You know, 1 Thessalonians 5 says, "Test all things and hold fast to what's good." Man, he did that. Potluck. Maybe, yeah, I'm just kidding, Scott. I'm supposed to eat with him tonight, and then I just said all those horrible things. A little bit of explanation perhaps is warranted before we get into our study tonight, because in a meeting that ostensibly has an evangelistic theme, it may seem a little strange to have a lesson called Happiness is a Choice. And the reason for that is that I am convinced that even people who have no seeming spiritual interest still want to be happy. In fact, I have initiated more than one conversation with people on a spiritual plane based on that question, are you happy? If I get to know them well enough and I can ask that question and just be comfortable with talking about that, are you happy? And if the answer is in the negative, then the next obvious question is, well, would you like to be? And unless something is, seriously miswired up here, people around the world want to be happy. And our friends and our neighbors and the people that we work with and rub elbows with on a daily basis, they want to be happy. And if they answer yes, then the next question is, well, how do you define happiness? Because we're going to see in this study tonight that while people want to be happy, oftentimes they do not know how happiness is really defined. Because for most of the people in our culture, I think that we can safely say that oftentimes they confuse pleasure with happiness. And I know that there is some elements of happiness in pleasure, but we do know that there's a completely difference in those two things. And if you don't believe that, then reread Solomon's autobiography called the Book of Ecclesiastes. And he thought that pleasure and power and possessions and all the rest would bring him the peace and the happiness and the purpose that he so desperately wanted to find in life. And by the way, when I read that book, I just find our modern world stamped all over that book. But anyway, we're going to talk about happiness for a few minutes tonight, and I hope that this will not only serve as something that might help us in inroads with conversations with our friends that we have a spiritual interest in, but I also hope that it will help to us to formulate or to redefine what happiness is in our own lives. I want to begin by saying that I certainly agree with Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of our United States, who said, "It has been my observation that most people are about as happy as they make up their minds to be." And that really is true, because happiness is indeed a choice, hence the title of tonight's lesson. And again, I'm convinced that millions of people on our planet really want to be happy. They search daily for that elusive goal of true and lasting happiness, but most people don't realize that real happiness lies in at least a couple of things. Number one, in our own mental makeup, making that decision, that choice to rejoice, and also, and more importantly, in God's owner's manual, the Bible. God really gives us the keys in both Old and New Testament of what happiness really is and how to be able to attain that. But there is a proviso that needs to be issued at the very beginning of this study, and that is simply this: people who seek for happiness as their primary goal never find it. Because happiness is not something that you can really seek for. It's not a quality that ought to be the summum bonum of our lives, ought to be our number one priority. I want to go through life and be happiness. But God says if you live life His way, then happiness is going to be a byproduct. And that's the message that I really want to communicate to you tonight. But the Bible teaches over and over again that we can make up our minds to harbor positive thoughts and happy thoughts and the right kind of godly thoughts if we choose to do that. It's all a matter of choice. I know this, that same Solomon said in Proverbs 23:7, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And that was true in the ancient world. It is still true today, folks. And all those books that I mentioned in my library this morning on positive mental attitude, I guarantee you, every one of them is based knowingly or unknowingly on that one verse right there. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So we got to get our thinking right. And it's critical that we formulate and reframe our thinking the way God would have us to do that. If you improve your attitude and your outlook, then you're going to bring more happiness into your own life and certainly into the lives of others. But proper attitude has to be coupled with proper action for happiness to come and stay. So it's not just a matter of making sure that I've got my mind right. You've also got to do the right things. In fact, I remember Jesus and John recording this saying that if you know these things, happy are you if you do them. So it's possible to know God's will and to be even unhappier. I know some miserable Christians. How about you? But it may be because while we know God's will and we're not doing it, there is that clear cognitive dissonance that's going on. There's a clear gap between what we're professing and what we're actually practicing. But folks say oftentimes that they want to be happy, but they aren't really doing the things necessary to bring it about. Or a lot of people that I know, maybe like you, or the things that they are doing thinking that they will make them happy are exactly the wrong things. Again, if we evaluate that from the standard of God's Word. In fact, I'm convinced that the worldly approach is exactly the wrong approach. Because the worldly approach is a very self-centered approach. It asks the question, what can I do to make me happy? And God's Word tells you, and especially in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as Jesus was trying to get His disciples thinking the right way in that first century world, that's not the way it works in Christianity. Christianity is not self-centered. It asks, how can I make you happy? How can I serve you? The way up is down. If you want to be greatest in the kingdom, then you need to become a servant of all. Only when you develop that servant's heart are you going to find yourself a happy person when you pillow your head at night. Now, the world doesn't know that, doesn't believe that, doesn't understand that. But God's people understand something that the world doesn't understand. In fact, in an already self-centered society, I've got one of those books in my library that's called The Me Generation. That pretty much describes our culture, doesn't it? And in an already self-centered society, it's going to come no closer to finding real and lasting happiness if we're encouraged to focus even more on our own selves and our own selfish wants and ambitions and desires. So the good book teaches that one of the best ways to acquire happiness for yourself is to devote your energies toward making somebody else happy. Or said another way, the way up is down. Happiness can be compared to a boomerang. A good friend of mine who's a member of the church came back from Australia one time when we were living in the Chattanooga area, and he said, "Ever wanted to throw a boomerang?" And I said, well, "If I can pick the people." No, I didn't really say that. But he took me out in the field. He showed me how to throw a boomerang. It looked easy on TV. There was a knack to it. But that's true. If you throw a boomerang correctly, it will always come back to you. And I believe happiness is that way. It really is a wonderful way that it works. If you make enough people happy, guess what? As a byproduct of that kind of priority, happiness is going to come and stay in your own life. So it's a double win situation. The person that you're trying to make happy wins by knowing that someone actually cares, and then you win because you have shown love and concern and a Christ-like spirit. And maybe that's at least in part what Solomon meant when in Ecclesiastes 11:1 he said, "You cast your bread upon the waters, and it will return unto you after many days." Again, said another way, what goes around comes around. So there's no doubt that God's Word teaches that our brains become magnetized by the dominating thoughts that we harbor in our minds. And there are a number of passages that talk about that, but one of them is Matthew chapter 12. Remember that when the disciples were concerned because the Pharisees had made a big deal of whether they had eaten things that were ceremonially unclean, whether they had been cleansed in a ceremonial sort of way. And the Lord said, "I want you to know that," and he didn't say what goes in the mouth is totally unimportant, but he said it's what's come out that you need to be concerned about. And what comes out of the mouth, what comes out of the speech, he said comes forth from the mind. So the basic message that Jesus was presenting in Matthew chapter 12 was what's in the well is going to come out in the water. And that's true with our minds. What's in the well will eventually come out in the water. And then in Philippians 4:8 is where Paul got in on the act and said to his fellow Christians in Philippi that basically, I want you to think about what you're thinking about. Remember that list that he gave of whatever things are good, noble, pure, praiseworthy, virtuous, think on those things. And Paul is telling us implicitly in that passage at least two things. Number one, you can control what you think about. The brain is a servo mechanism. You use the brain to control the brain. And the second thing he was communicating was there's always plenty of good things to think about if you will just dominate and make sure that you've disciplined your mind to think about the right things. And that's really, I think, the crucial breaking point where we are in our society right now. But again, it's all a matter of choice and effort. As Christians, folks, we have every right to be the happiest people on this planet. But you need to realize first and foremost that happiness is a choice, while misery is always optional. Make up your mind right now to be the joy-filled person that God says you can and should be. I like that Old Testament passage that David wrote, Psalm 118:24, when he said, "This is the day." You know the rest of it, don't you? "This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." Notice that as a decision of will. Get up in the morning and I make the choice to rejoice. I'm going to decide today that I'm going to rejoice. Now, there's a few things that we need to learn in order to be able to do all of those things that I have set before us already tonight. And a few principles that we're going to have to plug in and we're going to have to appreciate, we're going to have to practice on a daily basis. Because as I mentioned to my people back at university just a couple of Sundays ago, in fact, it might have been last Sunday, that I have people come into my office all the time. Scott probably has this experience. And they've got some kind of problem. And often, many times, those are people who have no affiliation with the church. But they come in to our building. They want to talk to, someone in charge. And there's nobody there, so they send them to me. And 2, 3, 4, letting you catch up. And they'll ask, can you help me with this problem? And I will ask them, how long have you been dealing with this problem? And you see, the thing is, what they want is a magic wand that will magically and immediately, instantaneously remove that problem. And so often, they didn't get into that situation overnight, and they're not going to get out of it overnight. You see, there are no easy answers. There's not one thing that you can do to get yourself out of this problem. It is a lifestyle. And I hope that God's people understand that to live the kind of life that we're describing tonight is not just a one-time thing that you do. It is a lifestyle. You live your life the way God wants you to live it, and happiness will come and stay. That's not my promise. That's the Lord's promise. And again, if happiness is the only thing that I'm trying to pursue, I'll never find it. But the first thing we need to do one of those principles is to understand that happiness is, in fact, relative. It's a comparative thing. You know, are you happy now? Well, you might think, well, compared to when I was in college or compared to when the kids grew up and moved out, or what are you talking about? It's kind of like the lady down in Texas who was asked, how's your husband? And she said, as compared to what? You know, it's relative, isn't it? So we've got to decide exactly what we mean, how we define real and lasting happiness. Now, I think when I was growing up, all the destitute children that I heard about lived in China. You already know where I'm going with this. As per the dinner table conversation, you need to eat your vegetables because there are starving children in China who would love to have what you have in front of you. Now, I have to admit that even at a very tender age, that was kind of a mixed message to me. Am I supposed to eat my vegetables so that the kids who are really hungry can't get them? But eventually I understood when I started using that line on my own children that while we may complain about having to eat such things as vegetables in this great country that we live in, there are people around the world who would love to have anything to eat at all. Happiness is relative. And by the way, I have to say that those very vegetables that came from our garden that I turned my nose up at when I was a child are the very things that I want now that I'm a geezer. But anyway, that's the way it is. Happiness is relative. And while we may complain about having to wear the wrong brand of shoes or clothes, there are some people that would love to have shoes or adequate clothes, period. Back when Dear Abby was the advice columnist in most of the nationwide newspaper, there was and I'm saying that this letter is dated, but still I think very germane to what we're talking about tonight because people haven't changed that much over the generations. There was a letter that was received by her and posted in the newspaper from a 15-year-old girl. It read as following: happiness is knowing, and some of this terminology will show how dated it is, happiness is knowing that your parents won't kill you if you come home late. Happiness is having your own bedroom, your own TV VCR combo, and your own phone line, again, dated. Happiness is getting the telephone call you've been praying for. Happiness is getting good grades and making your parents proud. Happiness is being a member of a popular circle at school. Happiness is having parents who don't fight. Happiness is knowing that you are as well dressed as anybody. Happiness is something I don't have. Signed, 15, and unhappy. And shortly after that letter was published, there was another letter that came in response to that from a 13-year-old girl who wrote the following: Dear Abby, happiness is being able to walk. Happiness is being able to talk. Happiness is being able to see. Unhappiness is reading a letter from a 15-year-old girl who can do all three of those things but still says she is not happy. I can talk, I can hear, but I can't walk. Signed, 13, but very happy. Happiness is relative. And we've got to decide, I think, as we're going through this passing parade that we call life, exactly what is that we want. I think that one of my preaching brethren who preached a lesson some 30 years ago that I had the privilege of reading later in book form said that he's exactly right. And especially in America, we have set our sights so high, and we want everything just perfect, to live in the perfect house, to drive the car that never breaks down. And we've set the bar so high that most people can't live up to those kinds of unrealistic expectations in terms of saying, I am a happy person. And that's a huge problem, I think, with the most of us. And we understand that at a certain level. But again, I want us to appreciate that happiness is a relative thing. Today up on the bus, I saw a lovely maid with golden hair. I envied her. She seemed so bright. I wished I were as fair. Then I saw her rise to leave and saw her hobble down the aisle. She had one foot and used a crutch, but as she passed, to smile. Oh, God, forgive me when I whine. I have 2 feet. The world is mine. And then going down the street, I stopped to watch some children play. I saw a child with eyes of blue. He stood and watched the others play. It seemed he knew not what to do. Why don't you join the others, dear? He looked ahead without a word, and then I knew he could not hear. God, forgive me when I whine. I have 2 ears. The world is mine. And then I stopped to buy some sweets. The lad who sold them was so kind. He said, it's nice to talk to folks like you. You see, he said, I'm blind. Oh, God, forgive me when I whine. I have 2 eyes. The world is mine. And so with feet to take me where I should go, and with ears to hear what I should know, and with eyes to see the sunset's glow, oh, God, please, please forgive me when I whine. I'm blessed indeed. The world is mine. By the way, this is free. I didn't plan to say this either, but it just occurred to me that I was able to hear Gene Stallings speak. Many of you know who Gene is, a brother in Christ who coached over at that little town in Alabama for a few years. David, you know who he is. And but after Johnny had died, their son with Down syndrome, he said, and this was in the dedication ceremony at the field at Faulkner University that they named after Johnny, which I think was appropriate. Isn't it time that we started doing that, naming our fields and our sports facilities after somebody whose life really matters and not just some sports icon? But he said, I tell you what, I'm getting out of the whining business. I'm not complaining ever again. He said, right up until the day that little Johnny died. And I think Johnny was probably close to 40, maybe in his 40s, which is a relatively long lifespan for persons with Down syndrome. And he said, you'd go into his bedroom at night, and even when he got to where he was struggling to breathe, and say, Johnny, how you doing, son? He'd go, I fine. And he said, no matter to the day he died, I fine. And he said, if that guy struggling for his next breath can be fine, he said, I can be fine with the degree and measure of health that I have. Happiness is relative. And I think that we would be a lot happier if we would understand that. And we come a lot closer, I think, to that elusive goal of real happiness when we learn to count our many blessings instead of, navel gaze and count our many woes. But also, and I know that you knew I was going to say this, I have to include this point. Happiness is not found in things either. We live in an affluent culture. In fact, Steve Farrar has called this culture one that has been afflicted with the dreaded disease of affluenza. And that's exactly right. We're so affluent that we're just sick with it. And we fail to realize how blessed we are as a people. Do you read bumper stickers at all? If you get stuck behind, somebody in traffic, you have to, because right there it is. But I suspect that bumper stickers say something about the likes and the dislikes of the persons who put them there, a lot like, people who have messages emblazoned on their T-shirts. But one day I read a bumper sticker that said, if you don't think that money buys happiness, you don't know where to shop. And of course, I got to thinking about that. I've seen one that's kind of ancillary to that says, money may not buy happiness, but it'll make you miserable in a better neighborhood. And yeah, I did. I got a chuckle out of it. But also, on further reflection, as the referee likes to say on the field, on further review, I got to thinking about that and thinking about the false conception and perception that's reflected in those kinds of bumper stickers, because that really is the mistaken notion that permeates our society that happiness brings contentment, or rather, possessions bring happiness and contentment, and it's just not true. Let me ask a couple of people who are in positions to know whether that's really true, and that's one of the reasons why I've already referenced the book of Ecclesiastes. Because, if you ask somebody, does money and possessions make you happy, and that person has never had any of either of those, then they may know what God's Word has to say on it, but they don't know from their own experience. And Solomon knew. I mean, that old boy was just filthy rich. And he knew when he wrote that book, that 12-chapter book, and said, money, possessions will not make you happy. And we need to listen to what Solomon had to say. We don't need to learn from our own sad experience that, after all, he was exactly right after we've gone through the crucible of life. And what he said was, listen to some of the things that Solomon was able to shop for. Can you imagine going into a mall and not just saying, here's the piece of clothing or the pair of shoes that I want from this place, that place? You could go in and buy the whole mall. And Solomon was in a position where he could do that. But reading from Ecclesiastes 2, starting with verse 4, and I just want to give you a brief list of some of the things that Solomon had. His possessions, his shopping list included houses, vineyards, gardens, parks, all kinds of fruit trees. By the way, me and I just got through touring Biltmore Estates, and kind of reminds me of Biltmore Estates when I read this passage. Reservoirs to water those trees, male and female slaves, larger herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem had ever owned, huge amounts of silver and gold, men and women singers. That one just kills me. They didn't have Bose radios back then, so if he wanted to hear some music, he just called in his own ensemble, and they sang to him. That's wonderful. And even in a harem, what he called the delights of the hearts of men. All of that is pretty much verses 4 through 10 of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Now I wonder, how would you feel if you were able to shop for so much? If your shopping list sounded a lot like Solomon's? Well, maybe you wouldn't feel the same way that Solomon felt, because listen to how he concluded that whole treatise there in chapter 2. Verse 11 says this, "And yet when I surveyed all that my hand had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. And it was a chasing after the wind, and nothing was gained under the sun." Solomon said, I pursued those things, and I bought those things, and I owned those things, and I stared at those things, and I was proud of those things, thinking that they would bring me happiness, and it was absolute rubbish. It was meaningless. It was a striving after the wind, and it did not bring me one modicum of happiness. Now, if there had been a bumper sticker on Solomon's chariot, it would have read, "He who dies with the most toys is still dead," because he knew the truth. Listen to what Jesus had to say about it, more importantly. In Luke chapter 12:15, you know this passage. He said, watch out, talking to his immediate disciples, but also in retrospect, or rather in prospect, he was talking to us as well. He said, "Be on guard against all kinds of greed, for a man's life does not consist in the abundance of things that he possesses." And then he follows up that point, of course, by talking about the parable of that rich man who had all of those things. That field had produced an unusually bountiful harvest, and that fellow thought he had it made. And he did not realize until the Lord told him, "You're going to die tonight. Tonight your soul," you remember that? Tonight your soul will be required of you. You're going to be carried off this farm, feet first tonight. Then whose will be those things that you have labored for all of these years? But the Bible says in that account that fellow thought that he had it made for at least two reasons. God called him a fool. Number one, he forgot that he was mortal. He forgot that his future life on earth was not guaranteed, and that he was going to die before that day was over. And the second thing was, the Bible clearly says that he was not rich toward God. He had absolutely no spiritual resources. And so this man was not a wealthy man by any stretch of the imagination. Doesn't matter how many zeros he had in his bank account. You know, it doesn't really matter how much shopping that we can do. Things still don't buy happiness. All these years later, they still do not buy happiness. They don't even result in lasting relationships, do they? If they did, then these wealthy sports icons and the movie stars and the recording artists who make millions of dollars each year, they would be in the happiest homes, the happiest families. They would be the happiest people. And oftentimes it's just the opposite of that. They're some of the most dysfunctional people that you would ever want to meet. And so money doesn't bring those things. It doesn't bring for us the love, the affection, and the devotion, even the part of our mates, our children, our God. So the only place to shop, folks, for inner peace and contentment and happiness is in a right relationship with our Creator. Now, that brings us to the final question: where do we find real happiness? And we just answered it, but I want to be a little bit more specific, and then we'll quit. Happiness seems to be like the elusive pot at the end of the rainbow, doesn't it? We already addressed that in the outset of this lesson. People who pursue happiness as their number one priority in life are never going to be able to find it. However, the Bible teaches in principle that happiness is not a destination. It is a way of traveling toward a destination. And if our destination is heaven, if it's to live with God's people here and then to someday see the face of God in the hereafter, then again, a byproduct is that we're going to be happy in that journey. In fact, it might be a lot simpler than we ever imagined. In the Reader's Digest, Andy Rooney wrote an article some years ago. It's very brief. I'm going to share it with you quickly. You remember Andy Rooney, right? Had more hair in his eyebrows than some of you have on the top of your head. But that guy. Anyway, Andy, he wrote this in Reader's Digest. He said, "For most of life, nothing wonderful happens. If you don't enjoy getting up and working and finishing your work and sitting down to a meal with friends or family, then the chances are you're not going to be very happy. If someone bases his happiness or his unhappiness on major events like a great new job, huge amounts of money, or a flawlessly happy marriage, or a trip to Paris, that person is not going to be happy much of the time. If, on the other hand, happiness depends on simple things like a good breakfast, or having flowers in the garden, or a good cool drink when you're thirsty, or a good nap, then more than likely you're going to live with quite a bit of happiness." More important, the writer of Proverbs that we have already quoted a number of times tonight had some very interesting observations to make about what really constitutes real happiness, and describing and identifying people who are happy people. And he informs us, again, this is a very brief cross-section. He informs us that the happy person is, listen to this, he who finds, gains, and retains wisdom and understanding. That's Solomon, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 and 18. He has mercy on the poor. That's going to be the happy person, he says, Proverbs 14:21. One who trusts in the Lord, Proverbs 16:20. one who is always reverent and respectful toward God, chapter 28, verse 14, and one who keeps the law. He's going to be perpetually happy, Proverbs 29 and verse 18. Now, it's interesting to note to me that in that very brief list that I just shared with you, those characteristics, none of them involve money or location or education or possessions or the attitude and actions of other people toward us. Happiness is not a place, folks. It is not an ideal set of circumstances. Happiness is a state of mind. When you can find yourself at any place in life, at any juncture in life, even when bad things happen to you, and you can still pillow your head at night and say, "It is well with my soul," God says that's when you're going to be a happy person. You may not even realize it at the moment. It may not be a serendipitous experience for you, but you're going to be happy. You're going to have that peace that surpasses all understanding, no matter what the world may say about it. And it's certainly true that others can interrupt our happiness temporarily, even when we're trying to be responsible and righteous. But still, there is that inner peace and joy that cannot and will not be disturbed by anyone or anything. Solomon again said this in Proverbs 29:25, "The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts the Lord will be safe." I want to share with you one last story tonight, if I may. And I know that I don't necessarily like to read from the pulpit, but I read pretty well. So hang with me for a moment. I think it'll be worth the trip. And it's called The Terribly, Tragically Sad Man. And it goes like this. Once there was a boy who lived in the big house on a hill. And he loved dogs and horses and sports cars and music. And he climbed trees and went swimming and played football and admired pretty girls. And except for having to pick up after himself, he had a pretty nice life. And one day the boy said to God, "I've been thinking, I know what I want to be and what I want to have when I become a man." And God asked, "What?" And he said, "I want to live in a big house with a porch across the front and have 2 St. Bernards and a garden out back. And I want to marry a woman who's tall and very beautiful and kind and who has long black hair and blue eyes and who plays the guitar and who sings in a clear, high voice. And I want 3 strong sons to play football with. And when they grow up, one will be a great scientist, one will become a senator, and the youngest will be quarterback for the New England Patriots." And he was very specific. And he said, "I want to be an adventurer who sails vast oceans and climbs tall mountains and rescues people. I want to drive a red Ferrari and never have to pick up after myself." And God said, "That sounds like a nice dream. I sure want you to be happy." And one day playing football, the boy hurt his knee. And after that, he couldn't climb tall mountains or even tall trees, much less sail vast oceans. And so he studied marketing and he started a medical supplies business. He married a girl who was very beautiful and very kind and who had long black hair, but she was short and not tall. And she had brown eyes and not blue. And she couldn't play the guitar or even sing, but she prepared wonderful meals seasoned with rare Chinese spices and painted magnificent pictures of birds. Because of his business, he lived in the city near the top of a tall apartment building that overlooked the blue ocean and the city's twinkling lights. So he didn't have room for 2 St. Bernard dogs, but he did have 1 big fluffy cat. And he had 3 daughters, all of them beautiful. The youngest, who was in a wheelchair, was the loveliest. The 3 daughters loved their father very much. They didn't play football with him, but sometimes they went to the park and tossed a frisbee, except for the youngest, who sat in her chair under a tree strumming her guitar and singing lovely, haunting songs. He made enough money to live comfortably, but he still didn't drive a red Ferrari. And sometimes he had to pick up things and put them away, even though they didn't belong to him. After all, he did have 3 daughters. And then one morning, the man awoke, and he remembered his dream. And he said to his best friend, "I'm very sad." And the friend said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I once dreamed of marrying a tall woman with black hair and blue eyes who would play the guitar and sing. And my wife can't play the guitar or sing, and she has brown eyes, and she's not tall." "Well, your wife is beautiful, and she's very kind," said his friend, "and she creates splendid pictures and delectable food." But the man wasn't listening. "I'm very sad," the man confessed to his wife one day, and his wife said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I once dreamed of living in a big house with a porch and having 2 St. Bernards and a garden out back. Instead, I live in an apartment on the 47th floor." "Well, our apartment is comfortable, and we can see the ocean from our couch," replied his wife. "We have love and laughter and paintings of birds and a fluffy cat, not to mention 3 beautiful daughters." But the man wasn't listening. "I'm very sad," the man said to his therapist. "Why?" asked the therapist. "Because I once dreamed that I would grow up to be a great adventurer. Instead, I'm a bald businessman with a bad knee." Well, the medical supplies that you sell have saved many lives, said the therapist, but the man wasn't listening. And so the therapist charged him $150 anyway and sent him home. I'm very sad, the man said to his accountant. Why? Asked the accountant. Because I once dreamed of driving a red Ferrari, never having to pick up after myself. Instead, I take public transportation, and sometimes I still have to clean up. Well, you wear good suits, and you eat at fine restaurants, and you've toured Europe, said the accountant, but the man wasn't listening. His accountant charged him $100 anyway, because he dreamed of driving a red Ferrari someday. And he said to his minister, I'm very sad. And the minister asked, why? Because I once dreamed of having 3 sons, a great scientist, a politician, and a quarterback. Instead, I have 3 daughters, and the youngest one can't even walk. But your daughters are beautiful and intelligent, said the minister. They love you very much, and they've all done well, and one is a nurse, and another's an artist, and the youngest teaches music to children. But the man wasn't listening. In fact, he was so sad that he became very sick. And he lay in a white hospital room surrounded by nurses in white uniforms, and tubes and wires connected his body to blinking machines that he had once sold to that very hospital. And he was terribly, tragically sad. And his family, friends, and minister gathered around his bed, and they were deeply sad too. And only his therapist and his accountant remained happy. And then one night, when everyone except the nurses had gone home, the man said to God, Remember when I was a boy and I told you all those things I wanted? And God said it was a lovely dream. And the man asked, why didn't you give me those things? And God said, I could have, but I wanted to surprise you with things that you didn't even dream of. Well, I suppose that you've noticed what I've given you is a kind, beautiful wife, a good business, and a nice place to live, and 3 lovely daughters, and it's one of the best packages that I've ever put together. But the man interrupted God and said, but I thought that you were going to give me what I really wanted. And God said, and I thought that you were going to give me what I really wanted. And the man asked, what did you want? You see, it had never occurred to him that God would want anything. And God said, I wanted to make you happy with what I'd given you. And the man lay in the dark all night thinking. And finally, he decided to dream a new dream, one that he should have dreamed years ago. He decided to dream that what he wanted most were the things he already had. And the man got well. And he lived happily on the 47th floor, enjoying his children's beautiful voices, his wife's deep brown eyes, and her glorious paintings of birds. And at night he gazed at the ocean and contentedly watched the lights of the city as they twinkled on one by one. I hope tonight that you remember that happiness is the journey, and it is not the destination. And the key to happiness is in being right with the God who made us. It has little to do with the designer label on our clothes, the opulence of the neighborhood in which we live, the kind of car that we drive. Those things are not what make us happy. Jesus said, I have given you an example. We referenced this earlier. I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you, and happy are you if you know these things and you do them. That's John chapter 13, verses 13 and 17. I hope that we got that. You see, just knowing God can make you even unhappier if you know His will and you're still not doing it. Please understand tonight this one central truth. Happiness is not found at the end of the rainbow, folks. Happiness is found at the foot of the cross. And that's what we call you to tonight. If you're not a child of God, unapologetically we say, this is the time to make that decision. Do you know that you can make a decision in the next moment of your life that will affect your entire eternity? If only you'll decide to come to Jesus in sincere submission, say, I repent of my past sins. I want to live the way God would have me to live from now on. Confess His sweet name as the Son of God and be baptized, where you contact His redeeming blood and have all of your past mistakes and sins and transgressions washed away. Some of us have done that. And we know that we're not happy because we're not doing God's will right now. And if you need to come home and make that right with God, we plead with you to come while we stand and while we sing to encourage you.
Falling for you and for me. See on the portals He's waiting and watching for you and for me. The Ye who are weary of earthly tenderly, Jesus is calling no sinner. Oh, for the wonderful love He has promised for you and for me. So